Okay, you guys, let's start. We got a lot to cover. The first thing I wanted to do was catch up on some administrative stuff. I wanted to make the syllabus and the criteria for getting an A a little more clear. You absolutely have to attend section to do well in this. Okay, we have a situation. Okay, so you get that. You're not going to tell me week 9 I thought section was optional. Yes, you have to go to section, and you have to go regularly. If you miss more than 3 sections, you will most likely flunk the course. The other thing is, this is a complicated class, and I am throwing so much stuff at you. You're not going to be able to enjoy the class if you're neurotically obsessed about memorizing everything and getting an A, because I am going to help take care of that for you. I know this is too much stuff. So, how we address this, so we don't have to make the course less interesting for you, less challenging, less comprehensive. We try to limit what you need to know for the midterm. And the way we do that is that 1 week before the midterm, I'm going to give you a study guide. The study guide will list all the terms out of these so many that I list in the lecture, the ones that you would expect. I think we're going to have an actual restraint scenario. Please don't tell the ASPCA. His naughtiness is just out of line. Come on, he's usually in a coma by now. Oh, I gave him a bath, so he's still all jittery about that traumatic experience. He was trying to induce you to pet him more after class, right? Smelling nice. Okay, so that midterm study guide is going to give you a list of terms that you're going to plug in as, say, fill in the blanks, simple IDs, then a smaller list of terms that you'd be maybe responding a paragraph to define, and then I'm actually going to give you, maybe not word for word, but pretty close, the actual essay questions that will appear on the test. And even though that's already completely limited, what's going to be on the midterm is such that I will list optional things. So don't worry if you look at that midterm and you still don't know half the things on it, because you only have to choose the half of the stuff you know. So in a lot of ways, we try to address this problem, because I know it's an introductory class, and we try to just make it more survivable for you. So in addition to that, the lecture slides should be online at least by the morning, so you can take a look at the slides and maybe get a sense of what lecture is about. Also, best kept secret so far, this class is actually posted on the web. So if you go to that oid.ucla, I'm going to actually post the link on our online website. You can get all these lectures online. And here's how I suggest you use them. While I'm talking, if something doesn't make sense to you, note the slide and the time and say, you know what, I'm going to fast forward through that lecture. I don't know how great your online connection is. Sometimes you'll find it's not so easy to do that, so you'll want to go where you have a good connection. And I'm just going to go to that 5 or 10 minutes I didn't understand, so you can get a reinforcement. Another way of succeeding and enjoying this class is coming to visit me in my office. So I'm there from 2 to 3 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I'm going to put my office number, now that they've given me one, online on the website, 7th floor of Bunch Hall. So I'll be there today, I will be there Thursday, and if you can't come between 2 and 3, let me know. I could probably stay later and meet with you then, but sort of save up some of the questions you have, the big picture questions that are the most challenging but the most fulfilling, and bring them to me or bring them to your TA, but don't let them sort of fester in confusion. We're here to be challenged. We're here to sort of push our brains back and try to surround an idea that's kind of too big for us. So a discomfort with these ideas is absolutely normal, and it means you're being challenged in your thinking. So again, visit me in my office, go to the online website, and understand there is going to be a study guide that's going to help make sense and order all of these priorities for you. Now, does anybody have any questions for me in these administrative issues? Okay, anybody have any questions? Quick ones, though, because we have a huge lecture to get through about stuff we've talked about. I bet you do, but that's okay. All right, so why, I suppose, first I want to address, what is the big narrative? So let's just recap a little bit. What is it that we're trying to do in this class? And why am I starting in antiquity with Christianity, early Christianity, and pagan philosophy, and Babylonian magic? Well, we really are in this class, as it says on the course description, it's really from 1600 to the present. It's modernity. But you know what? If we tried to understand modernity by just staying within modern society, we would not really get a very profound understanding of the sort of cultural DNA. All these cultural forces that are at work and contributing to who we are, their roots are all in antiquity. So if we want to have a much more profound understanding, we've got to empty that box, right, filled with all of these societal and cultural traits and characteristics, and we got to figure out not just where they come from, but we also have to respect there's something really, really interesting, exceptional, revolutionary departure from anything that has gone before aspect of Western society. And that is its thriving secular nature. There's something very specific about this course. We discuss science, magic, and religion as three separate spheres, right? Three separate spheres of authority, three different systems of knowledge. Well, that's unique to modernity, and we want to find out why. Why do we have to do it that way? This is a long-fought accommodation full of warfare. We keep hearing about the warfare, right, between science and religion throwing out magic. It looks like a very controversial process, because in a way it is. We're transforming a mindset of antiquity where you have a religious worldview and magic and technology, like building things and astronomy, would all be encoded within that religious cosmology. It took an amazing kind of intellectual discovery and revolution to reconceive modernity in the way it is. So we want to find out what forces were at play that forced us to drive nature and supernature apart. We also want to understand how complicated modernity is and how profound a role you play. The modern individual means that even though religion and science share the public sphere, share the power of the public domain in terms of institutional power, if you want to know why superstition, irrationality, magical thinking thrives, it's because the individual is such a powerful agent in our society, and it is you who drive magical beliefs, subjective understandings. So this gets to the other core thing we're doing. We're talking about different types of knowledge. Knowledge about the natural world being separated from knowledge about the supernatural world, but we're also talking about your private, subjective knowledge being separated from objective, shared knowledge, which is much more scientific or empirical-based knowledge. These things actually have their roots in antiquity. So in order to understand how we come about, we need to return there. We've talked so far about the caves of Chauvet. Why did we do that? Well, in a most essential statement, I would say that that was to show that religion is co-emergent with the very earliest cultural formations of human beings. We also talked about the kinds of shamanic rituals which involved altered states of mind, whether it be taking ayahuasca, whether it be listening to the chant of drums and being transported to another state of mind. Why do we talk about that? To bring to mind something that we very rarely recognize in historical narratives. The role of human consciousness actually seems to have a setting for sacred experience, for altered states of consciousness. People have been dialing in and out of this altered state since time immemorial. We have evidence of the role of mind-altering and psychotropic drugs and experiences as part of the source of the human religious imagination. So how can we take that out And that also, that inner subjectivity, that core conscious experience, that is the most sacred source in modern society for truth. You as an individual know that you're always told to go with your gut, to go with your instinct, to examine your conscience. As much as you're told to come here and study and learn a reasoned kind of argumentation and to find a kind of truth we can collectively share. Maybe you'll go into one of the scientific disciplines or how you'll contribute to this public domain of knowledge. You know that from our mother's knee, we were taught that there's this thing called conscience, and it isn't based on reason, it's based on subjectivity. So where does that idea come from? And that's another thing we investigate here. Magic. We had to re-encounter. We had to encounter that first in antiquity before we can re-encounter it in modernity. Now, we talked a lot about magic in the late syncretic world. That means 200 BC to 200 CE, so roughly that 400-year swing, and it refers to this very cosmopolitan period in Greco-Roman society, where Rome had already begun to expand, annex Egypt, open up trade routes and commerce. There were people flooding in from all over the world, right? We had people from Persia, people from Babylonia, we had Egyptians, we had people even coming in from India. So that this was a very eclectic world. And what is important about that is it's this Greco-Roman culture, this syncretic magic, that think of it as a cauldron, where 3,000 years of magical recipes, formulas, polytheistic gods, inscriptions on walls, potions derived from sacred plants, where all of this magic, 3,000 years of it, is thrown into this cultural cauldron because this society was very, very big on magic. They were very individualistic the way we are. They all had their own variation of what their personal belief was. And so they became a repository for stuff that otherwise would have been lost. And one of the important sources we're going to talk about today that comes out of this smorgasbord of antique magic are the corpus hermeticum, which is basically this syncretic knowledge drawn from all of these mysterious traditions of Egypt and Babylon and Persia, mixed with the intellectual and mystical traditions of Pythagoras and Plato, and the people we've talked about who try to find a much more orderly mysticism, combined into a philosophy that will be rediscovered 1,000 years later and form the very foundation of Western occult society. Our astrology, our tarot, the way alchemy is practiced is very much influenced by this work. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it actually was and who authored it. But we need to know we can't understand it without going back to antiquity, because these are rediscovered sources. Other things we've talked about so far are the roots of modern science. And again, some of it is in the technological things, right, like architecture and astronomy and medicine. But intellectually, the rigorous philosophical practice of determining things by human reason is a Greek phenomenon. It's a philosophical phenomenon. We would make a grave mistake to think we pulled this stuff out of thin air in the 18th century and we invented secular thought and we invented rationalism. No, that comes from very ancient sources, the pre-Socratics. That's the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Also, what we're going to talk about today is early Christianity and what role this played. We want to understand who we are. What is unique about this new phenomenon, Western civilization, European civilization? What did they bring forward that made them such a profound departure from the world of antiquity, which had been a thriving concern 4,000 years, the way we periodize this? Suddenly we come to this transformative period, the Middle Ages. And on the other side of that crucible is modernity. So we want to understand the sources that we took from antiquity the Christianity of antiquity, the Greek rational philosophy of antiquity, the magical thought of antiquity. Today we're going to go through the Middle Ages, this medieval period, this crucible of change and reinvention, on the other side of which is this extraordinary civilizational departure we call modernity. And if you think about the two things that really survived, the two pillars that survived the wreck of the antique world, they were Christianity and pagan philosophy. Wait a minute. I thought we understood science and religion as at odds. But now we have to rethink that. Science and religion were, in a way, I'll restate them as reason and faith, were the twin pillars of this new society. So it's a very shallow understanding of who we are to say, well, the progress of secularization is the triumph of reason over faith. The progress of secularization is the pushing out further out of superstition or religious ideas and the furthering triumphalism of science. That's not what happens, right? Science is very powerful today, yes. So is religion. So is magic. And if we understand that at the roots, science and religion were already making this kind of powerful synthesis that was going to allow this fledgling society to survive, we'll understand that there's an extraordinary amount of consilience between them, or consistency, sympathetic ideas. That doesn't mean we don't have this theme of warfare. Remember, these are two different systems of thought, right, coming from two different ethical traditions. And we have, in the words of Tertullian, who is one of the early church intellectuals, he himself is telling us, hey, you better be aware of that Greek philosophy stuff. It'll charm you. It'll make you so involved in things that are vain and ambitious and this worldly. And in the end, you know what you're really about? You are really about your spirit. And this brings us to something very profound about the essential difference and the essential sympathy in rationality and early Christianity. They're both very humanistic. And it's these two profound humanistic revolutions, a revolution in Christianity, that every individual is made in the image of God, and your most profound identity is your soul, your individual soul, which is going to get saved. Humanistic revolution. There's another profound humanistic revolution in secular Greek thought. You mean you're going to put human-centered knowledge, human reason, at the very center of how you understand nature, reality, ethical systems, political systems? Those are two absolutely humanistic revolutions, but they pull against each other, and yet they work with each other. So you'll find what we're really going to be discussing all along is this pull and push between faith and reason, desperate always to try to find a way to reconcile them, because you know you cannot live without some kind of faith, and you cannot have modernity without some kind of reason. And this is a theme from the earliest patristic period, from Tertullian, because even while he is critiquing pagan philosophy, what is he? He is an intellectual. And again, to emphasize, the New Testament is a wonderful, vivid, visionary, humanistic, ethical source of wisdom, but read on face value, it's parables to mobilize average, everyday people to some sort of drastic action, right? Some drastic moral recommitment of their lives. Why? Because the end is nigh. That's not going to appeal to an intellectual. But look for the things that are compatible in the background that made someone like Tertullian, that made someone like Plato able to reconcile pagan systems. Well, what were the pagan philosophers trying to do when they pushed reason forward? They were trying to din the noise, the chaos, the uncontrollable unpredictability of this pluralistic society that was run by a host of demons and priests who were casting spells and incantations to make these spirits of nature, or whether maybe these great gods of Olympus, who were whoever they were, trying to bend nature via some supernatural negotiation through gods, demons, and spirits. The Greek philosophers despised all that. In fact, their word magic comes from their pejorative description of the Magi, who were Persian magicians or Persian high priests, Zoroastrian priests, and it captures this sense that, all this magic, mumbo jumbo, all this stuff that doesn't demonstrate why it is through reason, through that clear reason, it is mumbo jumbo, it is foreign, it is suspect. We don't like it. So already, the pagan rationalism is taking a critical stance of magic. Who else is going to take a critical stance of magic? Christianity, right? Christianity is going to be critical of all the same stuff, right? The necromancy, the Babylonian astrology, the Zoroastrian priesthood, the Pythagorean numerology. All of this is going to be seen as not supported by the Bible, because the Bible is what is at the center, right, of this religious revolution? Monotheism. Monotheism means the power of the sacred is concentrated one place and one place only, in the hands of one almighty God. God does not share this power with anybody. He is radically transcendent in his authority, and therefore a world of goblins and demons and spirits and all of these other spooky things, and priests having magical powers through herbs. No, that is going to be antithetical to Christianity. So look, monotheism and orthodox creedalism, Christianity and pagan philosophy, are ultimately trying to create, in a way, an orderly universe. One centered on the order of reason, and one centered on the order of divine authority. But we're going to see that many of these early church thinkers, when they thought of the mind of God, they also saw it as the mind of reason itself. So these things were very compatible. Also think about the objectives. Spirituality, moral reward. So if you're a Christian in this early time, you'd be relating to the divine in a very different way, right? You're supposed to be working towards salvation. How do you serve God? Through ethical behavior, through moral sacrifice. You don't pull the levers and try to get God to do stuff for you. You're actually not supposed to ask God to help you win the football game, especially if you're sacrificing something before the game in order to do so. That would be considered not the way this divine God is supposed to be related to. So by the fact that you're creating an abstract system of spiritual reward and ethical orientation, can you see how that's also like what the Greeks were after? What were they after? They weren't really after being effective in the world. They weren't trying to build a better sports car or a mousetrap. They were after the reward of what? Knowledge, illumination, right? But they understood it differently. They thought this illumination would come from reason. The Christians thought the illumination would come through faith. But ultimately, those agendas converge. They want to discover the highest metaphysical principles of the universe, be it Christ or be it nous in Greece. That wasn't Zeus, by the way, nous. That was that idea we've been talking about of divine mind. We talked about how they're both humanistic. And the fact that Christianity seeks meaning through salvation and pagan philosophy seeks meaning through understanding, there's both this sense that you're working towards some form of revelation, right? Working always because there's a hidden, secret, better, higher truth, that you're directed upward and outward, that there's something more mysterious beyond this physical world. There's something more to understanding the world than understanding what spell is going to make, Hecuba in love with you. So this is shared in its aspirations to transcend the mundane. Again, one spiritually and the other intellectually. But we see that in someone like Augustine, these programs are united. I just showed two sides of things that were not exactly the same, two different programs, one more based on faith, one more based on reason. But what we're going to see is that the early patristic fathers absolutely united those programs. Augustine, who was a sort of self-indulgent rich boy, a sinner by any account, and very contemptuous of Christianity, actually was converted to faith. He had a mystical revelation. He didn't have it while he was reading the Bible. He had it while he was reading Platonist philosophers. Okay, so he has this mystical revelation while he's reading about, while he's reading Plato, and it helps him to understand something very important. He makes a connection between the gospel and between this revelation of Greek logos. In the beginning, he says, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning. Now that's John. So that's the gospel from the Gospel of John. And when we had Augustine reading Plato, he suddenly understood, I get it. Logos, Greek, which is the word for, it can be the word for word or Greek reason or the speaking of logical argument. It's this Greek idea of order, almost in the mystical sense. God, in Genesis, is naming things the way God, the one, the principle, that first principle in Greek philosophy, also brings things into being by naming them, creating categories and qualities. So this naming, this act of nomos, he discovers as the sort of esoteric reading of Genesis. Let there be light. And this is a revelation he has, and what we often see Christ referred to as the Logos. Christ is the Word made flesh. That's a Greek idea. That's an absolutely Platonic reading of the New Testament. And it's a way these ideas get converged and bring on board these intellectuals. If he couldn't understand the Word made flesh, if he couldn't understand this principle of God naming the world through order, through the reason of language, Augustine would have had no way to come to the New Testament. He needed the bridge of pagan philosophy, and that's what pagan philosophy becomes. It becomes a bridge to the works of Christianity for much of Greek and Roman culture. Okay, now, so moving forward, we sort of get that early Christianity is very Platonic, right? And it's very mystical, and it really is about understanding this larger transcendent mystery, this world of faith, this world beyond the here and now. And there's several reasons for that. If we look at the context in which early Christianity evolved, well, the only thing you could have was faith that you were going to survive. Because as soon as Roman order falls away, even though the earlier, the early German tribes and the early barbarian kingdoms tried to model themselves after Rome, within a couple of centuries, we'd lost literacy, coinage, so there was no commerce, there was no literacy, agriculture had petered to subsistence farming, population was drastically down. We're dealing with a world that was on the brink of extinction. If you had projected 300 years ahead, you wouldn't think you were going to have a European civilization. You would have thought you would have had, the woods taking over and people running around in them. That was the trajectory. But we had these twin pillars. You had this monastic society that preserved Latin learning, but it does so in that very specific sense. The Latin learning that is retained is this learning that Tertullian and that Augustine said, this stuff is okay. This stuff brings us to God. Any of the sort of naughty stuff, there was no Sappho, right? They weren't going to be saving the plays, the orgy scenes, certainly from any of the Roman literary canon. So it's a very specific kind of Latin learning, but it is this Platonic reason that is preserved. It's also very mystical and devotional. They're people who are not part of this bustling of exchange of ideas. They're retreated from the world into their monasteries. They're often copying documents from antiquity, but they're not trying to dispute about them or fight about them. They're trying to preserve the last record they have of wisdom as the light goes out all around the world. Right, this is a period where we have Magyars and Vikings and Muslims in, setting the fields on fire, burning down the monasteries. These people are under, and society itself, civilization itself, is under attack, both from within, because they don't have the structures to hold it together, and from without. And so we have a Christianity that is turned inward, contemplating the end of the world and looking forward to salvation. We have this brief moment, right, where Charlemagne comes on the scene in 800, he's crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Don't have time to talk about him, so I'm going to nail the important things, because we can't understand the civilization that comes after, medieval civilization, European civilization, unless we understand this project. Why is medieval civilization so fundamentally different from both antiquity and modernity? In fact, antiquity and modernity, in strange ways, have more in common with each other, as we will discuss, than we do with the medieval period. Because in a way, all of that, the slate had been wiped clean. It had been several hundred years since the fall of Rome. Most of that civilization had already receded like the tide. And what was left was just bits and pieces of this lost world. So Charlemagne was literally able to read the City of God by St. Augustine and say, I want to build that world. I'm going to build a world not like the cosmopolitan, crazy, polytheistic, secular, rational, you name it. It was all going on in antiquity. I'm going to have a focused vision where politics, society, everything is in moral alignment with the vision of God. I'm going to make the New Jerusalem on the hill. That is going to be this medieval vision, not cosmopolitan and worldly. It is something, he's going to bring Europe together. He's going to bring in the Germans. He's going to unify Europe, Christianize it. He's going to back up the Pope so that Western Pope actually becomes the head of the Catholic Church. And kind of touch and go there for a while. It looked like there might not be a Western church. Arianism was a heresy that was more dominant, actually, than the view now espoused by the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church was both beset by heresies within its own community and by the authority of the Eastern Byzantine Church. It was on its way out. Charlemagne props it up, gives us a Western Pope. You can't imagine the medieval period without this Pope, right? The ultimate shepherd of the people. He does something else that's very interesting. He puts us in this unified concept called Christendom. So there is unity, but it's all around a single idea. You can't call the medieval era theocratic, because it was ruled by kings and an aristocratic class, not by popes and priests. You can call it theocentric, because the world that Charlemagne described, first of all, he took all the Latin learning he could get his hands on, the appropriate stuff. And he took these few books and he copied them over and over and over again. So there was a standardized version, everybody on the same page. He created parishes all over his empire so that everybody was being taught from the same book. So there was one idea resounding all throughout Europe. One sanctified idea, one way of understanding God, one way of worshiping God, right there in the cultural fabric. He also begins this notion of the three orders. Those who fight, that's the aristocrats. Those who pray, those are the priests and the Pope, of course, and those who work. That's everybody else. That's everybody who has to actually work for a living. Why this notion is so fundamentally unmodern? You're, first of all, understand your identity not as an individual, but what are you doing? What is your role in the body, the corporate body of society? So even though you can say, well, that's kind of secular because those who fight and those who pray are separate orders. And that's true. That is the beginning of the split of church and state. But at the same time, everybody's on the same mission. And that mission is from God. Nobody is supposed to have a different agenda than the agenda of salvation for all of society. So that is a society. And so what we have to understand, why it's so different. Every single person is supposed to be on the same page. That page is the Bible, and they all better be working towards the same goal. We're here to build a city of God, and we are here to be saved. And think about it. This was a society that was on the brink of distinction. Just the way you could look at the ancient Jews, on the brink of extinction over and over and over again. But it was this vision of Jerusalem, this pulling together of all the intellectual resources, all the military resources, all the economic resources, and saying, this is who we are, this is our vision, we are committed to one God and one destiny. And so this idea held the world together. But it also was understood to hold the world back. In order to become modern, we had to break with this theocentric, monotheistic, monopolistic idea and all become the different individuals we were, not those who pray or those who fight or those who work to serve God. Ultimately, you decide who you're going to serve. Some people are very secular. Some people are serving their career. They're not sure what's going to happen when they die, so they're deciding that their ultimate end game or goal is this world. Other people are going to decide that they're going to devote themselves to the next world. You didn't have that option to make that decision back in the medieval period. And remember, a society so fragile can't afford to have slackers, naysayers, and heretics. We can't afford to have somebody reading off the page when we're about to be barnstormed by the Vikings. So this is why, in a way, when we look at these medievalists, we can't understand. We're going to talk about witchcraft on Thursday. Why are they burning all these heretics? Why are they taking this reactive position? It's because literally the survival of society is at stake. It's an idea that is profoundly unmodern, and we have to understand how that idea is both the source of what created Europe. You couldn't have had Europe without that idea, but you can't have modernity without going back to antiquity and breaking that idea. And one of the things that happens is that grip, that Platonic, mystical understanding of the world is broken by a new kind of learning that comes in the High Middle Ages, which we roughly date from about 1000. After 1000, population picks up, we have agricultural revolutions, we start to have commercial revolutions, cities begin to develop. Europe is looking outward. It's not just shuddering inside its fortress walls anymore. Europe is finally looking outward. It's the High Middle Ages. And what happens is that all of that Latin learning that had gotten through a peephole, right? The stuff Tertullian let in, the stuff that Augustine and all the other patristic fathers, the stuff they let in because it would be a handmaiden to religion, that religion couldn't have survived without it. All of a sudden, that peephole, the door is broken down and a rush of new translations come in. Why? Well, Toledo fell in the 12th century. Toledo had been part of an Islamic caliphate, and Islam had not gone through a dark ages. Islam was thriving and cosmopolitan. It had not lost access to this world community of scholars. So the learning from antiquity that they had was much more comprehensive, much more complete than what Western Christendom had had. And now you had a bit of a crisis. The church was once again stormed with reason and had to find a way of either accommodating this reason, owning it, claiming it, synthesizing it, or putting it down. Because you cannot afford to have, in this medieval worldview, two separate systems of authority, one for reason and one through faith, one Aristotle's in charge of and one the church is in charge of. You can't have that. But this is very, very threatening. We get, in the old church, what Charlemagne had put through, you just had logic exercises, grammar, some sort of harmless passages to learn how to refine your speech. You'd read some pagan orators, but you didn't get any of the really heretical ideas because those were left out. But now you had all sorts of explosion of learning. You had Aristotle's corpus. Aristotle is hugely important to the evolution of scientific thought. So far, we've been talking about science as an intellectual, philosophically rigorous practice of the mind. That's what Plato did. And that's what most of the philosophers did, because what they were after was knowledge. That was the big payoff. Aristotle, although he's a great admirer and student of Plato, he rejects Plato's preoccupation only with the metaphysical and says, I want to learn about nature through nature. So instead of staying in my, kicking around, and I guess they didn't have studies, did it outdoors, but anyhow, this idea that it is through the mind that you're going to have the purest revelation of truth, that's not modern science. Modern science is about empirical observation, and that is exactly what Aristotle's materialism also valued, going out there, writing down things, observations of the natural world. So he had a meteorology, he had zoology, he had biology, he had political treatises, treatises on ethics, even treatises on psychology, rhetoric, economics. He was incredibly comprehensive. Now, when you have all of this information suddenly popping out, because once they get a hold of Toledo and the scholars of Europe find out, hey, there's this stash of great documents, they can't keep them out of there. They all rush to Toledo, start translating, start bringing these documents back to the universities, and the church has lost control. The church, what was all about controlling that message, had lost control. And what is wrong? Some of the stuff in Plato, some of the stuff in Aristotle is very dangerous. First of all, he has a very different notion of the soul. So he could really ruin that beautiful idea of the ideal forms, the eternal soul that was supported. You have to fudge with it a little bit, but if you take Plato, you can graft it onto an idea of an eternal human soul. Remember, that wasn't part of old world pagan polytheism. Christianity had to find a philosophical basis for that, other than I said so. And they found it in Platonic philosophy. Now Aristotle is pushing aside this doctrine of forms, and one where forms aren't eternal, right? Forms are just the thought of God, and the minute the bunny dies, we talked about this earlier, well, he's not thinking about the bunny anymore. I guess the bunny's dead eternally. So this was dangerous. And it was out of the box and out of control. At this time, you already had in the 1100s and 1200s an explosion of university systems. So think about it. Universities are getting their money from who? Mostly the students. Mostly they're taught by people who are absolutely churchmen, and they might have religious sponsors, but they're way, way far away from the Vatican, right? They're taking place in cities. The church has very little control of what's going on intellectually. So we shouldn't see this again as church versus the anti-church. This is a debate going on inside the church, because these were churchmen themselves who were taking this Aristotelian philosophy and saying, we need it, our students want it, they want to study law, they want to study medicine, they want to find out about this world, and they're not really obsessed with finding out about the nature of the Trinity. Okay? So we need to discuss something else. So you had this tremendous push-pull. It was a crisis. If the church didn't take responsibility for this knowledge, either squash it so nobody can have it, if you let this knowledge become a rival system of authority in somebody else's hands, you've lost that cosmology we've been talking about, where religion is the sphere that controls everything. The book of nature, and the supernatural revelation of the Bible. It's in control of everything. The church makes a decision. Why it is such a successful institution in the High Middle Ages was a time when it reached its highest flowering. It decides, we better own this. First it tried banning it to no avail. The decision was made by, we're going to just talk about it. Thomas Aquinas began writing his Summa Theologica. It was many, many books long. Took him most of his life. He died before it was finished. But he's an interesting character because he was deeply mystical religious person. His religious credibility could not be challenged. He had actually joined a very poor mendicant order. He was a Dominican. His commitment to Christ, he was not one of these worldly, citified university clerics. He was really a man of of God, unimpeachable credentials, but at the same time, he loved Aristotle, and he saw in Aristotle part of God's gift to the world, part of God's knowledge. And he actually saw it would be a great crime against Catholic theology to exclude this knowledge, because this too is part of the wisdom of God. So he comes up with a formula that reconciles faith and reason. And that's where we get that saying, we can have faith in our reason and reason in our faith. He averts this crisis, right? And by writing the Summa Theologica, and what he lets us know is that just the way God's mind is an orderly mind, we should see that order in his creation. That means there are natural laws. So of course, let Aristotle study the natural world. Ultimately, it's God's creation, so that is part of what we do. Now, let Aristotle be a handmaiden. He's got a lot of information about the natural world. But where Aristotle contradicts the Bible, we always defer to the Bible. So it's not equal. Aristotle is not as authoritative, but Aristotle is brought in as a handmaiden. So this horrible disputatious philosophy that could have destroyed the church is instead, Aristotelian disputation was very popular in the university systems, and they would actually take tracts of the Bible and say, student A, they would find contradictory tracts in the Bible. Nothing you want to point out that the Bible is contradicting itself. They would actually go to these contradictory passages and say, student A, you argue why you think passage A is correct. Student B, you take passage B. Now fight it out amongst yourselves. This is a dynamic intellectual process that's trying to refine truth, find a higher kind of truth, using reason to interact with the Bible to figure out what God is really talking about, coming up with C. So this would have been, in the old outlook, incredibly heretical. The Bible is something you just read and faithfully defer to. But this more scientific, more investigative, more reason-driven Aristotelian reading means we read the Bible and we try to make sense of all of its complexities, all of the places it contradicts itself. That reason is actually part of the process of understanding God's message to us. So we need our reason in order to fully understand what it is we need to have faith in. That God has given us both the book of nature and the book of Scripture, and the order of our minds is a corollary to the order of natural law and the orderliness of God's own divine creative spark. So what kind of a universe do we get now that Aristotle is brought on board? We've got this whole new Aristotelian cosmology. The church is profoundly powerful after accepting on this educational system, right? We get an incredible explosion of universities and more scientific, more curiosity about the natural world. So we should see this as, again, science and religion forming a synthesis, the Aristotelian synthesis, and both advancing stronger than it was before. Science just got to trail in all of this preliminary learning of Aristotle. And religion got to march in and be in control of this incredible new university system because it is teaching its own Aristotelian canon, and this is how they adopt Aristotle. Well, very helpful. Aristotle says that the earth is in the center of the universe, and that the earth specifically is a place of corruption and change. Well, that makes sense. Biblically, we already know that this is an impermanent and an essentially and fundamentally flawed. This is not Eden. This is not heaven. This is a place of corruption, sin, and change. If I bite an apple and I put it down, I cannot return to it 7 years later and enjoy the same apple. Corruption and change. So in Aristotle's philosophy, he used not atomism, but remember the 4 elements that we had with Empedocles: fire, earth, water, and air. You have this world of corruption and change, and above it, above the moon, that's where you have celestial perfection. So above the moon, where you have the planets, they move in perfect spheres because God is perfect. Only in this incorrupt, impure realm of the terrestrial world do we have imperfection. Everywhere else in God's cosmos, things are perfect. And beyond the outermost sphere of Saturn are the angels, the archangels, and then God himself. So Aristotle was adopted to a moral hierarchy that moved from the earth as the lowest point, but the center, still the center. It's a very anthropocentric universe with the world at the center of God's creation, moving upward and outward until finally, at its most transcendent aspect, you have God. And Aristotle's laws were very helpful to understanding nature in a way that is compatible with modern science, with Old Testament creation. A very troubling aspect of paganism and polytheism, and even Platonism, was that this notion that penetrating all of matter is an aspect of the divine. That means if I chip hard enough at this wood, somewhere in there is the essence of God. In an emanationist philosophy, God exists, right, first, and then he emanates all of these other outer forms. So what we're experiencing is the outer surface of reality, but in its innermost essence is the divine. Wait a minute. That is very clear in the Bible that God's creation is separate from him. God is not in the podium. God is on high. He's radically transcendent. He has nothing to do with matter. Spirit and matter, radically separate phenomenon. You don't go mixing those. If you do, well, you're a pantheist and a heretic. So this pantheistic strain that had been hanging out in Christianity because of Plato caused all these problems later with heretics and mystics who claimed to be able to achieve oneness and unity with God. Well, how do you shut that down? Make it clear that God is separate from his creation, that matter and spirit are not mixed. That's a concept that's going to come in handy for modern science. It's going to work for the church. Again, see? It's compatible. There's something compatible, something they both need out of this Aristotelianism that is going to be good for science and good for the church. But before we get this notion that just because we've taken God, right, the big divine God himself out of nature, this is still not yet the impersonal nature of modern science. This is not atoms knocking each other around in a void. This is not mechanics. They don't have modern genetics. They can't explain to you why a seed grows into a tree. They don't have modern physics. They can't really explain why if I held an apple, it would drop to the ground. And so when they try to understand these animate forces in nature, they understand them as part of the nature, the animus, the soul, the drive of matter itself. So we're still trapped in a pre-modern cosmology, because if Aristotle and a medieval-minded person is trying to describe why it is that apple drops to the earth, it would say, well, its predominant element is it's made of earth. We had those 4 elements. Earth wants to be at a state of rest. It wants to be at a state of rest at the center of the universe. Ergo, it's going to fall. Wait a minute. Look how I just described that. The apple wants to fall. The apple has a plan. It has a place it wants to go. That's fundamentally unmodern, right? Apple, motivated by its own will. So that's almost personified in a way. And we call this amatory matter, amore, to love, to want to do something. And it also has this idea of telos. It means nature is not random, but nature has encoded into it its own, the fulfillment of its desire. So rest is better than motion, right? Because if you're at a state of rest, you're closer to where you want to be. I thought motion was relative and nothing was at a perfect state of rest. We need a revolution in modern science that is yet to come, that will spring forth from the mind of Galileo, but we don't have it yet. We're still living in an enchanted universe where matter is in constant flux, constantly wants to become something else, constantly transforming itself to a more and more perfect state, trying to fulfill God's design. And that's not so good necessarily for modern mechanical thinking, but it does support a very, very rich alchemical tradition. You take this notion of alchemy. Today we associate it with trying to find the quintessence, right? The ultimate primary substance in matter, or trying to turn base metal into gold. We associate it with all of these things, right, that we associate more with magic than with science. But if you read your Bruce Duran, you know that he is saying, hold on. Alchemy is actually the milieu in which modern science arose. Modern science doesn't arise on the side of alchemy. Modern science arrives because of alchemy. Not despite alchemy, but because of it. So that's taking a story that had been seen as just about the past, that alchemy was something backward-looking, and taking it and radically rereading it as part of the scientific revolution itself. So we've got to make sense of that. Why is that true? We're going to see that alchemical practices were interpreted within a strict philosophical discipline. All of this Aristotelian knowledge formed the theoretical basis of philosophical alchemy. So that's very scientific. When you're conducting experiments according to a theoretical framework, look, they're conducting experiments. That itself is different. It's a different ball of wax than what we had with Plato and all of this intellectual reflection. These alchemists were out there trying to find new formulas, taking things apart, distilling them, experimenting with different kinds of chemicals and compounds, inventing laboratory equipment. So really, experimental science, this experimental aspect of science, where you experiment in the context of a theoretical framework, we get that in the 12, 13, 1400s, and we get it through alchemy. Where does the word come from? What is it? Well, alchemia starts with the principle of just smelting, of taking metals, taking different substances, it's mostly metallurgical, and melting them, distilling them, separating them, putting them together. It was like a practical industrial art, 1st and 2nd century CE in the Mediterranean world. And think about it as kind of a practical art form. If you wanted to create glaze for a glass, if you wanted to create a medicine for a wound, if you wanted to get some color in your cheeks, you can't go to the local CVS, right? Especially after the Roman Empire fell, this alchemical tradition was very, very popular because if you wanted it, chances are you had to make it yourself. So there was a very, very entrenched craft tradition of people smelting metals, whipping up ointments and unguents, trying to get beautiful white fluffy skin. They have these recipe books where they give recipes for hydrating creams and things like that. It's not philosophical yet. But when we get that basic tradition of craft alchemy, which is a sort of household products, industrial arts mixed together, very metallurgical. When we add those practical practices to this onrush of Aristotelian thought in the 1100s, we get the philosophical alchemy that starts to evolve in the 11, 12, 1300s. And it takes these principles, this is what makes it work. Remember, we have this idea that the 4 elements are constantly changing. And there's ultimately a goal. So right here we have that the bunny is made of the fire, air, water, and earth. But that's just the underlying principle that there's 4 elements that constitute all the substance of nature. But underneath fire, air, water, earth, there is a unifying single substance, prima materia. 4 elements, quintessence, the 5th element. It's locked in there. It's this ultra, ultra pure substance. We talked about the sublunar realm. That's where change and decay, where the earth is. Well, that's where we have most of this change and decay. But if you go above the moon, where the planets and the stars are, that stuff is made purely of quintessence, prima materia. And we know that prima materia is underneath, lying under this substance. So if we can take our alchemical knowledge and we can take a substance and burn it and turn it into powder and then add liquid to that powder and then try to boil it and vaporize it, if we keep tormenting these substances, maybe we can unlock the pure essence within. What can you do with this pure essence within? You can do stuff like heal people who are sick. You can do stuff like take base metal and turn it into gold. This is a powerful, powerful idea that drives all of this alchemical procedure, right? And there's this other idea, we talked about amatory matter, right? That things move through the universe and act through the universe because they're constantly in a state of change, not randomly. This is God's universe. They're constantly trying to perfect themselves and become what God wants them to be. That means if you're an apple, you want to be at the center of the earth because earth wants to be at the center. It also means if you're a base metal, you ultimately want to become the most perfect form of yourself. You want to become gold. And if you are an alchemical wise man, and you know enough of these Aristotelian principles, and if you experiment in your lab over and over again, maybe you can help nature along. Maybe you can interfere with these divine laws by understanding them, accelerate the process, just help base metal become gold. Now this should be, it's both exciting and it's Aristotelian, and the church has approved of Aristotle. So at first, this is not considered heretical, but you can see kind of how it's going to get into trouble because kind of sounds a little bit magical. These people are trying to manipulate natural laws to produce outcomes in nature. The church at first does not condemn these practices. The first real statement against alchemy comes because they're called counterfeiters. Right? So they're helping the kings who are in desperate need of money. You got a pound of gold, an alchemist who really understands how to mix metals will be able to turn that pound of gold into 2 pounds of gold. You can make more coins, and if he's good at what you do, unless you can have a laboratory do an atomic analysis of it, you're not going to know that it's not gold. It's going to bite like gold, look like gold, have the same density. So this was actually a real thing. Turning base metal to gold wasn't just wizardry and magic. It was actually a technology these people were practicing. And it got them in trouble with the church. The church isn't really mad at them for their ideas. Why is the church mad at them? Because they're making the secular princes too powerful. So it's really now the manifestation of a kind of power struggle rather than a fundamentally philosophical struggle. Because all this stuff that the alchemists do, in this sense, of the Aristotelian sense, all stuff that the church, by deciding to accept Aristotelian philosophy as its own natural system of knowledge, implicitly signs on to. And here's just a list of some of the things we've already discussed about, I used the example of base metal wanting to become gold. Another good example to understand this sense of matter trying to perfect itself, and alchemy becoming the sort of intellectual discipline by which you can affect that perfection. Coal becomes a diamond. And it's all about purification, getting to the purest, most complete form of something. And how do you purify things? Well, you know, if we're taking a modern chemistry class, one of the things we do in a Bunsen burner, right, is doing what the alchemists were doing. You might want to boil something and turn it into another form, like boil water, turn it into vapor. You might want to boil something to purify it. You might want to take something and burn it in order to get rid of certain properties and be left with a fundamentally transformed substance. So much of what they did in alchemy involved either distilling things, like that's an alembic above, and it captures vapor. So you might boil something and then capture its vapor, or you might distill something and capture its water below. That's a retort below. It will capture water. Above would capture vapor. But you're constantly trying to transmute substance, vapor, from liquid to gas, from solid to burnt, from solid to liquid, constant experimentation with the transmutation of minerals, of plants, of substance into into more and more pure forms. And what we remember them for is the pursuit of gold. And we already talked about this, that they actually, rather than being considered lunatics, these were considered very wise men, very learned men, and given all sorts of prestige at court and making very good money. And the church didn't like this because you don't want to let people get out of your control. It's one thing when most of this is being practiced by churchmen who are ultimately controlled by the church. They don't do something you like. If you do something you don't like, you can control them. But what do you do if they're hanging up at court and they have this powerful benefactor or protector? So it's an issue of losing control. And we have Roger Bacon here, who is a great example of this philosophical alchemy, which was at once scientific, magical, and religious, all rolled into one. We have with Roger Bacon, he is known as one of the first great experimenters. He innovated a lot of this equipment. He did a lot of what we consider proto-chemistry. And his favorite experimental substance was blood, because he thought if you strip away all the impurities of blood, all of those accretions that are elements of the modern world, of the corrupt terrestrial realm, if you strip everything away, the principle of life will exist. And with that principle of life, you can magically heal any illness. So he was constantly doing stuff we would consider freaky and weird, like burning blood. He spent most of his afternoon burning blood and mixing it with other agents and then distilling it and trying to do everything to mix it with substances that will draw away the impurities and leave the pure form. And yet, what is he doing but chemical experiments when he's doing that? He also was incredibly important to the development of lenses. So he was a very good geometrician and understood grinding lenses. So if we don't have lenses, we don't have Galileo seeing the moons of Jupiter, we don't have a scientific revolution. Again, because these guys were hands-on, they wanted experimental equipment, they're into technology, they're into grinding lenses, making things, enhancing the eyesight, enhancing things so that you can observe more carefully the physical world. Not just think about it. That's modern science. And also a very, very religious man. He considered himself a Christian, but in his Christianity, which was less chaperoned by the church constantly had to be worried about people's creative interpretations of the Bible, and that's why Catholicism oftentimes, you didn't encourage the masses to read the Bible. It wasn't a problem. They couldn't read anyhow, but the Bible was always chained right to the altar at the church. It was chained. This was not something everybody could read, because then you start getting heretical interpretations. And Roger Bacon was convinced that the world was ending. So he was both a scientist and a magician, and also a person of such religious faith that he fully believed that Christ was coming. So he was one of these heretical sects that saw the end is nigh. So in him we have a very rich example of all of these tributaries, all of these historical tributaries passing through a single actor. I'm going to end briefly introducing the Corpus Hermeticum. So you have 3 minutes, so I'll use it. Why is this different? Well, we were talking about that world of magic, the Babylonian mysticism, the Egyptian numerology, the secret books of the dead, the recipe books for spells, all of that magic that was flourishing in the world of antiquity. The Greco-Roman world of antiquity had this rich, syncretistic type of approach to religion. The more the merrier. All that stuff was pushed out by both Christianity And Greek rational philosophy, that stuff was pushed out of the core curriculum, right? That doesn't show up with Charlemagne, that doesn't show up with Aristotle. Could have been pushed out to the margins. But another profound event happens. And it too is associated with a type of Renaissance. We have the fall of, the crumbling, actually, of the Byzantine Empire. It is beginning to weaken, and more we have incursions of the Ottomans. And so you get these Greek scholars who have still these original Greek works, amongst which were these corpus hermetica, all of this Hermetic knowledge. They start fleeing and bringing this information into Italy, where we have the Renaissance. Now, we're going to talk about magical knowledge, but they're also bringing all of that forbidden secular stuff, like the plays and the naughty poetry and the love of beauty and the love of the human body and the love of human history and thought. So this is the third time that Western civilization is now again being confronted with its past. And it is a big shakeup. And just so we understand what this Hermetica is, between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, when we were actually a very rich time philosophically, we have the Platonists, then the Neoplatonists, we have a very rich commercial context in which people are trading and bringing information and gods and wisdom and texts from all over the world. Around this time, this knowledge called Hermetica takes shape. And what it does is it combines all of that magical, I feel a little bit under pressure. Anyhow, how do I say this in 2 seconds without you running away before I finish my sentence? Can it be done? I bet it can. Norton, give me a hand here. Okay, so anyhow, we'll take up this, but I'm going to say this is the door that magic gets back through and gets back into Western society, and it transforms alchemy and turns it into heresy.